Rain pounded relentlessly against the windshield, turning Portland's streets into shimmering waterways under the dim glow of streetlights. David Harper's hands gripped the leather steering wheel of his glossy black BMW, his knuckles whitening under the strain. The headlights cut through the swirling mist, illuminating the rain-drenched chaos ahead. The rhythmic sweep of the wipers only emphasized the silence pressing against him, a quiet at odds with the city's clamor. Around him, Portland surged with frenetic energy, blaring horns, hazy streaks of light reflected in puddles, and pedestrians darting beneath umbrellas. Yet David felt utterly removed, as if he were an outsider gazing at the world through a glass pane. His day had dragged on, marked by a predictable business meeting and triumphs that felt increasingly hollow. He didn't despise his life, not entirely, but there was an emptiness, a gnawing void that left him restless. The rain thickened, cascading in heavy sheets as David neared an intersection. He eased his foot onto the brake, his car slowing to a crawl. That's when he noticed her, a solitary figure hunched under the deluge, her presence faintly outlined against the curtain of water. His brow furrowed as he squinted through the downpour. As his car crept closer, the silhouette resolved into a woman clutching two small bundles tightly to her chest. Her drenched coat clung to her thin frame, and her shoulders shuddered visibly with fatigue. A fierce gust of wind swept back the hood covering her face, revealing sunken cheeks and a pair of wide, terrified eyes. David didn't hesitate. Logic and caution were drowned out by an instinct he couldn't name. His hand was on the door handle before he realized it. Rain struck him like icy needles as he stepped out of the car, his tailored suit absorbing the storm in seconds. "Mom," David's voice rang out through the relentless hiss of the storm. It was steady, firm, yet carried a note of gentle concern. The woman flinched at the sound, instinctively retreating a step, while clutching the bundles in her arms, babies, David realized with a sudden pang. Their tiny forms, tightly swaddled, quivered faintly against her chest. "I'm fine," she replied, though her words wavered, cracking under the weight of exhaustion. "Leave us alone." David's gaze shifted, taking in her soaked figure before scanning the desolate street behind her. The darkness seemed too thick, the sidewalks eerily deserted. "You're out here drenched, with two infants," he said, his voice low but resolute. "That's not something I can just walk away from." Her chin rose slightly, a flicker of defiance crossing her pale, drawn face. Yet behind it, David could see the unmistakable shadow of desperation. "I'll manage," she insisted, though her unsteady footing and trembling hands told a different story. David took a slow breath, softening his tone. "Look, I'm not here to hurt you. I only want to help. My car's right over there. It's warm and dry, certainly safer than standing out in this." Her hesitation was palpable, her teeth pressed into her lower lip as her eyes dropped to the baby she held so protectively. The storm battered against them, cold and unforgiving, as she wrestled with the decision. I can't trust," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "I understand," David interjected gently, sensing the weight of her mistrust. "But this storm won't let up, and your little ones need warmth. Just let me help, nothing more." Her dark eyes, filled with exhaustion and weariness, met his for a long, charged moment. The defiance in her stance faltered, her shoulders sagging with resignation. Just for tonight," she said finally, her voice trembling but soft. "For them." David gave a small nod, stepping to the side as he opened the car door. She climbed into the car, her every movement deliberate as she shielded Ethan and Jacob from the relentless rain. David followed, shutting the door firmly behind him and cranking the heater to full. The soft purr of the engine filled the quiet as he stole a glance at her. She sat rigidly, her drenched coat dripping onto the leather seats, her arms encircling the babies, as if they were her only anchor. "What's your name?" he asked, his tone gentle, careful not to startle her. "Lauren," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper, her gaze locked on the twins. "This is Ethan, and that's Jacob." "David," he said, gripping the wheel. "You're safe now, Lauren. Let's get you someplace warm and dry." The mansion came into view, standing tall and resolute against the raging storm. Its sleek, modern design, a blend of glass and stone, was both imposing and inviting. As they entered, the glowing lights seemed to chase away the cold, though Lauren hesitated, her steps faltering on the immaculate marble floor. The warmth of the house wrapped around them, a stark contrast to the freezing rain outside. Lauren's presence felt almost foreign amid the refined decor and hushed elegance of David's home. She lingered awkwardly in the grand foyer, her wet shoes squeaking against the polished surface. Her wide eyes darted around, taking in the pristine surroundings, her wariness palpable. "Let me take your coat," David offered, stepping forward, his hand extended with quiet reassurance. She instinctively stepped back, her grip tightening around the babies. "No," she said quickly, her voice firm but uneasy. "I'll keep them with me." David raised his hands, his expression neutral, though a flicker of understanding crossed his face. "All right," he said, his tone measured. "Nathan will bring some towels. Just wait here." Almost on cue, Nathan appeared, his sharp features accentuated by his calm, observant demeanor. His gaze swept over Lauren, pausing briefly on the twins. For a moment his brow furrowed, as though a distant memory stirred, something just out of reach. As though some distant, long-buried memory had stirred, Lauren noticed Nathan's sharp gaze fixed on her. Instinctively, she tightened her hold on Ethan and Jacob. Nathan's expression softened for a fleeting moment before he gave a brisk nod and disappeared down the hall to retrieve what she needed. Meanwhile, David, standing at the edge of the room, adjusted the thermostat, his focus partly on the controls and partly on Lauren. She trembled not merely from the cold, but from the undercurrent of fear that flickered in her eyes. Yet there she was, standing tall in her vulnerability, her resolve unbroken for the sake of her children. A paradox of strength and fragility, David mused silently. "Let's get you settled," he said, his voice softer now, more coaxing. Lauren didn't reply, but her hesitant steps followed his lead deeper into the house. Behind her, Nathan lingered in the dimly lit corridor, the weight of his curiosity almost tangible as he watched her retreating figure. By the time they reached the warmth of the living room, the rain had subsided, though a chill clung stubbornly to Lauren's soaked coat. She cradled Ethan and Jacob closer, as if their warmth could chase away her unease. David's mansion exuded a quiet hum, the vast walls and high ceilings bearing an air of elegance that felt impersonal, almost oppressive. Lauren perched on the very edge of the couch, her hands gripping the twins tightly, as though they were her only lifeline. From his post by the doorway, Nathan leaned against the frame, his arms crossed. His sharp, penetrating gaze followed Lauren's every move, not with distrust, but with an intensity that hinted at something deeper, a search, perhaps for a thread of recognition. He remained silent, though the tension in his stance spoke volumes. David returned from the kitchen, a tray balanced carefully in his hands, steam curling upward from 2 mugs of tea. "Here," he said simply, setting the tray down on the coffee table. His eyes lingered on Lauren, watching as she hesitated, her exhaustion apparent. Finally, she reached for one of the mugs, her hands trembling slightly, though whether from fatigue or apprehension was unclear. "They must be hungry," David remarked, nodding toward the twins nestled against her. "Nathan, could you?" "I've got it," Nathan interrupted, pushing off the door frame with deliberate ease. He moved with quiet precision, vanishing into the hall before Lauren could voice any objection. Her wary gaze flickered toward David, her uncertainty as palpable as the warmth rising from the mug in her hands. "Don't mind him," David reassured her, sinking into the armchair across from her. "He's meticulous, maybe too much so, but his intentions are good." Lauren managed a faint nod, her fingers curling tightly around the warm ceramic. For a brief moment, the weight of her circumstances seemed to lessen, though the storm within her lingered just beneath the surface. "This is a lot," Lauren said softly, her voice barely audible. "I mean, for someone you don't know." David's gaze rested on her, his expression unreadable. "I don't usually bring strangers into my home, if that's what you're thinking. But you were out there, in the rain, with those kids. His tone was measured, almost detached, as he let the words linger. Let's just say I've seen enough in life to recognize when someone truly needs help. Lauren's lips parted, as if to offer a response, but the weight of his words, or perhaps the weight of her own circumstances, rendered her silent. Her eyes drifted downward to Ethan and Jacob, now asleep against her chest. Their tiny faces, peaceful and untouched by the turmoil surrounding them, softened her features. The scent of food wafted in from the kitchen as the housekeeper prepared dinner, and David's steady, if slightly awkward, attempts at conversation began to ease Lauren's initial unease. Nearby, the twins, freshly fed and swaddled in soft blankets, slept soundly in a makeshift crib. So David began after a moment, his voice carefully casual. "You're from Portland." Lauren stiffened slightly, but gave a small nod. "Born and raised." "And their father," he gestured subtly toward the crib. Her hand faltered midair, the fork poised above her plate. "He's not in the picture," she said flatly, her voice betraying a touch of bitterness. David waited, the silence between them gentle but expectant. Slowly, hesitantly, the story unfolded, a whirlwind romance with Aaron, the excitement and fear of an unexpected pregnancy, and his cold detachment when the reality set in. Lauren recounted how he had vanished when things became difficult, leaving her to face it all alone. She spoke sparingly, her clipped words carrying the weight of unspoken pain. "And then the hospital," she murmured, her voice dropping. "When they took the boys after they were born, I thought it was routine. But then, a nurse came in and started talking about adoption, said I couldn't provide for them." Her hands tightened into fists, her knuckles pale. Something wasn't right. They kept pushing, and when I refused, I overheard them talking about taking them anyway. Her voice faltered, breaking under the strain of recalling the moment. She stared at her plate, her cheeks flushed with embarrassment at the confession. David leaned back, his face somber, his jaw tight. "You did what you had to do," he said quietly, his tone carrying no judgment, only understanding. Lauren nodded, her posture rigid. "I didn't have time to think. I just grabbed them and ran." At the kitchen doorway, Nathan stood, his arms folded across his chest. He had listened silently, his sharp features unreadable, but her words struck something deep within him. The determination in her voice, the trembling edge of defiance, stirred a flicker of recognition, something painfully familiar. When Lauren moved to clear the table, Nathan stepped forward without hesitation. His voice was blunt, though not unkind. "You're limping." She paused, startled by his observation. "It's nothing," she replied, shaking her head. "I twisted my ankle when I was running. It'll heal." "Let me see." The statement was firm, leaving no room for argument. Lauren hesitated, glancing between Nathan's steady gaze and the twins. Reluctantly, she sank back into the chair, carefully shifting Ethan and Jacob to the couch. Rolling up the cuff of her jeans, she revealed a swollen ankle. Nathan crouched beside her, his hands steady and deliberate as he examined it. His brow furrowed slightly, but then his attention caught on something else, a faint scar. "You've got a scar here," he remarked quietly, his voice dropping, "shaped like a leaf." Lauren froze, her heart racing. "How do you know that?" she asked, her voice trembling with confusion. Nathan's breath hitched, his throat tightening as memories resurfaced, childhood laughter, scraped knees, and the soft, pleading voice of a little girl. "It's you," he said, the words tinged with disbelief and wonder. "Lauren." Her gaze locked with his, wide and startled, as a flood of emotions passed between them, unspoken yet unmistakable. Lauren felt the room shrink around her. The walls seemed to close in, heavy with the weight of her realization. Nathan's voice softened, trembling under the burden of emotion. "I'm Nathan. I'm your brother." The air thickened, charged with disbelief and the gravity of unspoken truths. Lauren stared at him, Her lips parted, but no words came. What she finally whispered, her voice barely breaking the silence. Nathan stood, the realization pressing down on him, his movements slow and deliberate. "You're Lauren," he said again, quieter this time, as though speaking it aloud could confirm what he already knew in his heart. "You're my sister." Lauren shook her head, her brow knitting in defiance. "No, that's impossible." Her voice was steady, but a flicker of something recognition, doubt shone in her eyes, betraying her denial. Nathan pressed forward, his voice thick with emotion as he gestured toward her leg. "That scar. I remember it." "You were 6, he began, a bittersweet smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "You wouldn't give up on riding that old, rusty bike. No matter how many times you fell, you were so determined." His voice softened as memories surfaced, bittersweet and vivid. "The last time you crashed into the bushes. I carried you back to the house while you cried the entire way. I told you the scar looked like a little leaf, and you believed me." Lauren's eyes widened, her hand instinctively covering the faint scar on her leg. She acted as though shielding it could erase the truth of his words. "How could you possibly know that?" she murmured, her voice barely audible. "Because I was there," Nathan interjected, stepping back as the tide of memories overtook him. His voice, heavy with regret, faltered slightly. "I was there until I wasn't, until I had no choice but to leave." His hand ran through his hair, his jaw tightening with the weight of long-held guilt. "When I came back, everything was gone. The house, our parents, and you. All of it, gone. All I found was silence." Lauren shook her head again, more forcefully this time, her breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. "No, that doesn't make sense. My brother Nathan, he left. He abandoned us." Her voice cracked, trembling under the weight of the accusation. "I never wanted to leave," Nathan said softly, lowering himself to her level. His gaze locked onto hers, pleading for her to understand. "I had no choice. My work, as an undercover agent, was dangerous, too dangerous. They made me cut ties, erase every trace that could lead back to you and Mom and Dad. I thought I'd have time, that I could come back." His voice wavered, his eyes dropping as guilt clouded his features. "But by the time I could, it was too late." Lauren's breath hitched, her hands gripping the edge of the couch, as though it was the only thing grounding her. They died," she whispered, her voice a tremor of disbelief. The words hung in the air, almost a question. "Mom and Dad? The accident?" Nathan nodded, his Adam's apple bobbing as he swallowed hard. "I couldn't find you, Lauren. I searched everywhere. Foster systems, orphanage records, I combed through everything. But you weren't there anymore." The silence that followed was stifling, broken only by the soft, even breaths of Ethan and Jacob sleeping nearby. Lauren's gaze fell to her lap, her fingers absent-mindedly tracing the faint outline of the scar on her leg. "I didn't think anyone was looking for me," she finally said, her voice empty, void of the emotion that had previously overwhelmed her. "I thought I was alone." Her words struck Nathan like a blow to the chest. He sank down beside her, his elbows resting on his knees as his head fell into his hands. "I should have tried harder," he whispered, his voice thick with regret. "I should have found a way to bring you back." Lauren watched Nathan, her defenses slowly crumbling under the weight of his raw regret. "You really are him," she whispered, almost to herself. Her tone softened, filled with a blend of wonder and disbelief. "You're Nathan." He nodded, his shoulders sagging under the heaviness of years gone by. "I'm here now," he said softly, his voice steady yet weighted. "And I'm not leaving again. I promise you that." Her expression wavered, a fragile mix of anger, pain, and longing flickered across her face. Tears welled in her eyes, and when she finally spoke, her voice cracked. "Why didn't you come sooner?" The question hung in the air, sharp and unyielding. Nathan turned toward her, anguish etched into his features. "I couldn't," he admitted, his voice hoarse with emotion. "I didn't know how. Every door seemed shut, and I was a coward. I convinced myself it was too late, that I'd already failed you." Lauren's tears spilled over, her breath hitching in uneven sobs. "You don't get to say that," she said, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and heartbreak. "You don't get to come back now, after everything." I know Nathan's voice barely rose above a whisper, but it carried the weight of years of guilt and longing. "I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I'll spend the rest of my life trying to earn it, if you'll let me." Her tears streamed freely now, her shoulders quaking under the flood of emotions. For a long moment she simply stared at him, her chest heaving as she struggled to breathe through the tidal wave of feelings crashing over her. Then, suddenly, she reached out, her hand gripping his arm tightly. "Don't make promises you can't keep," she said, her voice trembling with vulnerability, but her grip didn't falter, as though she feared he might disappear if she let go. "I won't," Nathan replied, his voice steady despite the storm raging within him. He placed his hand gently over hers, grounding them both in the fragile truce they had begun to build. The room seemed to breathe with them, the unspoken years of separation tentatively starting to mend. Outside, the rain returned, its soft, rhythmic patter against the windows mirroring the quiet tears of a city witnessing their reunion. The next morning arrived cloaked in muted shades of gray, the remnants of the storm lingering over Portland like a persistent memory. Lauren stood at the expansive bay window in David's sprawling living room, her gaze fixed on the rain-slicked streets below. Nearby, Ethan and Jacob rested peacefully in their bassinet, swaddled in soft blankets. Their rhythmic tiny breaths filled the otherwise silent room with a sense of fragile calm. Sleep had eluded Lauren. The weight of the previous night's revelations her brother Nathan lost but now found pressed heavily on her heart. From the kitchen, the low hum of voices reached her ears. Nathan and David were deep in quiet conversation. David stood by the counter, pouring steaming coffee into 2 mugs, his expression uncharacteristically gentle, stripped of its usual guarded poise. "You doing okay?" he asked Nathan, handing him one of the mugs. Nathan nodded, though his gaze lingered on the living room, where Lauren stood motionless by the window. "She's stronger than I thought," he admitted, his voice soft. "But there's a lot to make up for if I'm going to fix this." David took a measured sip of coffee, his eyes thoughtful. "You've got time," he said calmly. "She's here now. That's what matters." The quiet was broken by the soft cries of the twins from the living room. Without hesitation, Nathan made a move toward them, but David raised a steady hand. "I've got it," he said, setting his mug down before walking toward the bassinet. Lauren turned as David approached, her eyes meeting his briefly. His presence, calm and deliberate, carried a reassurance that steadied the tension in the room. Ethan's cries softened as David gently lifted him, his practiced hands cradling the infant with care. Lauren turned as David approached, watching as he gently scooped Ethan into his arms with a natural ease that caught her off guard. The infant quieted almost instantly, nestling contentedly against David's chest. "You're really good at that," Lauren remarked, her voice tinged with surprise. David offered a modest shrug, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "I've handled enough boardroom tantrums to know how to manage a crisis. This, not so different." A soft chuckle escaped Lauren, unbidden but genuine. It was a tentative sound, yet it stirred something within David. His eyes lingered on her, catching the subtle way her lips curved, her expression lightening for the briefest moment. "You should sit," David said, his tone carrying a quiet firmness. "You're still recovering." "I'm fine," Lauren replied, though the shadows beneath her eyes betrayed the truth of her exhaustion. David didn't push further but motioned toward the couch with a steady hand. "Humor me." She hesitated, then settled onto the couch, her eyes following David as he gently rocked Ethan in his arms. Lauren hadn't anticipated this side of him. The man who had seemed all sharp angles and no-nonsense efficiency just the night before now cradled her child with an unspoken tenderness that made her pause. Later that afternoon, Nathan threw himself into a flurry of activity around the house, channeling his swirling emotions into productivity. He arranged for groceries to be delivered, assembled a sturdy crib in one of the guest rooms, and mentally cataloged every item Lauren and the twins might need. Trying to show off, Lauren's voice broke the quiet, startling him as she leaned against the doorway. Her arms were crossed, but a faint smirk softened her features. Nathan straightened, a screwdriver still in his hand. "Just trying to be helpful," he said lightly, though his gaze held a seriousness that contradicted his casual tone. Lauren stepped further into the room, her eyes falling on the newly assembled crib. "It's nice," she admitted, a hint of appreciation in her voice. "You didn't have to go through all this effort." "I did," Nathan responded without hesitation. He set the screwdriver aside and turned to meet her gaze directly. "You're my family, Lauren. Taking care of you is my responsibility now." For a moment, Lauren's expression shifted, caught between gratitude and a lingering sense of reservation. Finally, she spoke, her voice quiet but firm. "You don't have to do it alone." "I know," Nathan said, his tone resolute but softened by sincerity. "But I want to." That evening, David made a call to Rachel, explaining Lauren's precarious situation. "I need someone sharp," he said, pacing back and forth in his study. "Someone who knows how to cut through the red tape and make sure she's safe." "I'll be there in an hour," Rachel replied, her voice clipped and assured. When she arrived, her presence was striking, poised and authoritative, carrying an energy that immediately commanded attention. Nathan, who had been sifting through documents with David, looked up, his body stiffening slightly as she entered the room. "This is Rachel," David said, motioning toward her. "She's my lawyer and an old friend. Rachel, meet Nathan, Lauren's brother." Rachel's sharp eyes flicked toward Nathan, assessing him with a keen intensity. "Brother, huh?" she said, her voice light but tinged with curiosity. "Nice to meet you." Nathan gave a small nod, subtly straightening his posture. "Likewise." The interaction was brief, but the tension in the room was palpable. Rachel's composed confidence seemed to contrast sharply with Nathan's guarded demeanor, and yet neither broke their gaze. "Let's get started," Rachel said briskly, cutting through the charged silence as she laid her bag on the table. Later that night, as the house settled into a peaceful stillness and the twins lay soundly asleep, Lauren found David in the living room. He sat in a quiet corner, a glass of whiskey resting casually in his hand. She lingered in the doorway for a moment, unsure, before finally stepping inside. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice breaking the silence. David looked up, his expression unreadable. For what he asked, his tone even. "For everything," Lauren replied, motioning subtly toward the room around them. "The house, the food, giving us a place to be when we had nowhere else." David leaned back in his chair, his gaze contemplative. "Don't thank me just yet," he said, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. His tone carried a touch of humor. "You might regret it once you realize how dull this place can get." Lauren returned his smile, small but genuine, shaking her head gently. "I don't think I will," she said, her words carrying a quiet certainty. David stepped closer, his face set with determination. "What do we need to bring this to light?" "A lot," Rachel admitted, leaning back in her chair, her expression serious. "I can start by drafting formal requests for detailed records, but this will stir up trouble, so we need to be ready for resistance." Nathan nodded, his focus sharp. "Pushback is inevitable. That's why we need a strategy to stay ahead." He tapped a pen rhythmically against the table, his thoughts clearly racing. "I'll leverage my contacts to dig deeper, but this operation's reach means we might need someone embedded on the inside." Rachel's brow lifted slightly, skepticism flickering across her face. "Are you suggesting infiltration?" Nathan's gaze didn't waver. "I am." Rachel's lips pressed into a tight line. "That's a risky move. If they're as connected as we suspect, you'll be exposed before you can get anything useful." "I can manage it," Nathan said firmly, his tone leaving no room for doubt. David interjected, raising a steadying hand. His voice was calm, but it carried a weight of authority. Our priority right now is evidence collection. If infiltration becomes necessary, we'll plan it carefully and leave no room for error." Rachel nodded in agreement, though she fixed Nathan with a pointed stare. "Don't go rogue on this, Nathan. We need caution, not heroics." Lauren stood just outside the doorway, her breath catching as she listened to the exchange unfolding in the room. She hadn't meant to overhear, but the weight of the words adoption records, resistance made her pulse quicken. Summoning her courage, she stepped into the room, her presence immediately drawing everyone's attention. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice steady, though an edge of worry lingered beneath it. David turned to her, his expression softening with reassurance. "We're investigating the hospital where you gave birth," he explained gently, "trying to figure out what's really happening." Lauren hesitated, her arms instinctively crossing over her chest as if to shield herself. "And what do you think is happening there?" she asked, her voice quieter now. Rachel stepped in, her tone calm yet firm. "We suspect the hospital is involved in something much larger than it appears on the surface. It's possible they're exploiting vulnerable mothers, perhaps for illegal adoptions, or even worse." The blood drained from Lauren's face as the implications sank in. She lowered herself into a chair, her body tense. "So, it wasn't just me," she whispered, almost as though she feared the answer. "No," Nathan said softly, moving to sit across from her. His tone carried a quiet determination. "You weren't the only one. But we're going to put an end to this." Lauren nodded faintly, uncertainty clouding her eyes. "I don't know how much I can help," she admitted, her voice trembling slightly. "That day, everything was such a blur. I barely remember anything." "That's okay," Rachel interjected, her voice steady and kind. "Leave the investigation to us. You just focus on yourself and the boys. That's what matters most right now." Later that afternoon, Lauren sat on the couch in the living room, her eyes following David as he knelt on the floor. Ethan and Jacob lay sprawled on a soft blanket, their tiny hands reaching for the plush toys Lauren had carefully placed around them. David's suit jacket was tossed over the back of a chair, his tie hanging loosely, a rare glimpse of his unguarded self. "They seem to like you," Lauren said, a small smile tugging at her lips as Ethan giggled at David's exaggerated facial expressions. David glanced at her, his own smile softening. "Well, they must have excellent taste in people." Lauren let out a quiet laugh, shaking her head. "You don't give yourself enough credit, David." He leaned back, his elbows resting on his knees, his expression shifting to something more introspective. "I wouldn't exactly call myself father material." "Why not?" Lauren asked, her tone carrying genuine curiosity. David hesitated, his gaze drifting to the twins, who were now happily cooing at each other. "I've always been better at solving problems, not connecting with people." Lauren tilted her head slightly, studying him. "You've connected with them," she said softly. "And with me. That has to mean something." David's eyes lifted to meet hers, his expression unreadable for a moment. Then, in a quiet voice, he replied, "Maybe it does." As the afternoon stretched on, Nathan immersed himself in a pile of documents in the study, his focus unrelenting. Across the room, Rachel typed away at her laptop, her brow furrowed as she drafted a series of formal requests. Their partnership was seamless, their efficiency undeniable, though moments of tension flickered beneath the surface. "You're not great at staying still, are you?" Rachel remarked, her tone wry as she kept her eyes fixed on the screen. Nathan smirked faintly, not looking up from his notes. "Patience has never been my strong suit." Rachel leaned back slightly, her sharp eyes glinting with amusement. "That's clear. But jumping into things without a plan doesn't help anyone." "I don't jump," Nathan said, his tone calm but firm. "I act when it's necessary." Rachel folded her arms, leaning back in her chair with a knowing smile. "We'll see about that." That evening, Nathan convened a meeting in the living room. Lauren sat anxiously beside David on the couch, her fingers tightly gripping the edge of the cushion. Across the room, Rachel leaned casually against the wall, her arms folded but her sharp gaze attentive. Nathan stood at the center, a stack of papers in his hands and a weight of urgency in his posture. "We've got a serious problem," he began, his voice calm but carrying a gravity that filled the room. His eyes flicked toward Lauren. "Lauren, someone's been watching you and the twins." The air seemed to freeze. Lauren's breath hitched, her hands instinctively moving toward the bassinet where Ethan and Jacob lay sleeping. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Nathan placed the papers on the coffee table, his movements precise and deliberate. "I've uncovered evidence of surveillance," he explained. "Unmarked cars parked near the house, strange activity on the street. Whoever is orchestrating this isn't just after the hospital. They know exactly where you are." David's jaw tightened, his face hardening as he processed the information. "Then we can't waste any time," he said firmly. "We need to act." Rachel straightened from her position against the wall, her tone clipped and decisive. "We'll implement security measures immediately. I'll escalate our investigation to ensure we're ahead of them." Lauren's voice trembled as she spoke, the fear and uncertainty in her eyes plain. "What are we supposed to do now?" Nathan turned to her, his gaze unwavering. "We fight back," he said, the determination in his voice unshakable. The tension in David's mansion grew thicker by the moment. Rachel, impeccably dressed in a tailored blazer, examined a folder filled with falsified credentials Nathan had meticulously prepared. Across the room, Nathan adjusted his tie using the reflection in a polished glass cabinet. His normally composed demeanor showed the faintest crack, a subtle hint of unease. David strode into the study, his commanding presence undeniable, though the rolled-up sleeves of his shirt betrayed the informal urgency of their plans. "The hospital administrator is expecting us at 2:00, he announced, his voice steady. "I've arranged for the tour under the guise of an investor interested in expansion opportunities. You'll have about an hour to gather information before they start asking too many questions." Nathan nodded, his movements deliberate as he slipped a small recording device into his pocket. "We'll get what we need," he said with quiet confidence. Rachel looked up from the file, her gaze sharp and assessing. "And if things don't go as planned?" Nathan allowed a faint smirk to touch his lips. "They will." Rachel raised an eyebrow, clearly unconvinced, but chose not to argue. David handed each of them a sleek portfolio embossed with the name of a fictitious healthcare investment firm. "Stay in character," he advised, his tone firm but measured. "They're expecting investors, not investigators. Keep it professional." At the hospital, the pristine white corridors shimmered under the harsh glare of fluorescent lights, their sterility concealing a darker reality beneath the surface. A composed administrator in a tailored navy suit greeted Nathan and Rachel. Her polished demeanor was betrayed by a smile that never quite reached her eyes. "We're delighted about your interest in our facility," she said, guiding them through a hallway adorned with posters extolling the hospital's neonatal care services. "Our neonatal unit is among the most advanced in the state." Rachel nodded, her tone crisp and professional. "Impressive. We're particularly interested in understanding your patient intake process, especially how you manage during high-demand situations." The administrator's polished smile faltered ever so slightly. "Of course, efficiency and compassion are at the core of what we do." As the tour continued, Nathan's keen eyes picked up on details others might overlook: the hushed conversations between staff, the doors labeled authorized personnel only with heavy locks, and the averted gazes of certain nurses. Meanwhile, Rachel masterfully kept the dialogue going, her pointed questions subtle yet probing, designed to extract information without raising alarms. At a strategic moment, Nathan excused himself, pretending to take an important phone call. Slipping away unnoticed, he approached a nearby office marked records. With practiced skill, he bypassed the lock and slipped inside. The room was dim, illuminated only by the faint glow of a computer terminal. Filing cabinets lined the walls, their metal frames cold and unyielding. Navigating the system with efficiency, Nathan uncovered disturbing irregularities: birth certificates with identical dates, adoption documents conspicuously missing parental consent, vague discharge summaries with little to no details. Each anomaly painted a clearer picture of something deeply sinister. He snapped photos of the most incriminating files, ensuring every critical detail was captured. The faint sound of footsteps in the corridor jolted him. Nathan moved quickly, slipping into the shadows just as the door creaked open. A nurse entered, her cautious expression scanning the room. He held his breath, every muscle taut, until she left moments later. Once the coast was clear, Nathan exited the room with practiced stealth, his pulse steady but his mind racing with the gravity of what he had just uncovered. Back at the mansion, Lauren sat cross-legged on the plush living room rug, her gaze fixed on Jacob as he babbled incoherently at a toy giraffe. The cozy warmth of the room, combined with the soft patter of rain against the expansive windows, offered a fleeting sense of normalcy amidst the turmoil. David entered, his tie loosened, sleeves rolled up, and an uncharacteristically relaxed air about him. He paused at the sight of Lauren, a small smile curving his lips as he crouched beside Jacob. The baby, as if sensing the comfort in David's presence, immediately reached for his hand, gripping it tightly. "He's taken to you," Lauren said softly, her voice carrying a warmth that had been absent in recent days. David glanced at her, his smile growing. "That's probably because he hasn't figured me out yet." Lauren let out a gentle laugh, shaking her head. "You're better with them than you realize. You should give yourself more credit." David leaned back on his heels, resting his arms casually on his knees. "They're easy to care for," he said, his tone quieter now. "You're the one doing an incredible job with them." Lauren turned to him, her expression softening. "I couldn't manage it without your support, without any of you." David's features shifted, a flicker of tenderness breaking through his usual composure. He opened his mouth to speak, but Lauren's gaze clouded with concern. "Do you think we'll ever feel safe?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. David's jaw tightened, his resolve unmistakable. "We'll make sure of it. I promise." Later that evening, Nathan and Rachel returned, their faces etched with tension. The dining room, typically serene, transformed into a makeshift war room. Papers, photos, and hastily scribbled notes were spread across the polished table. Nathan took center stage, his tone clipped and professional as he shared his findings. "There's a clear pattern," he began, scrolling through images on his phone. "Birth certificates have been altered to match fraudulent adoption records. Parental consent forms falsified." He paused, pointing to a photograph of a steel door labeled "Restricted Access." "Whatever's behind that door, they're hiding something significant." Rachel chimed in, her voice sharp and precise. "This isn't incompetence, it's deliberate. Whoever orchestrated this has powerful resources and connections." At the far end of the table, Lauren sat pale but resolute, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "What's the next step?" she asked, her voice steady despite the tension lining her face. Nathan exchanged a glance with David and Rachel before answering. "We need more evidence, but we have to act fast. They're already suspicious. If they sense what we're doing, they'll lock everything down." David nodded, his voice firm and resolute. "Then we don't wait. We make the first move, and we move quickly." As if on cue, David's phone buzzed against the table. He glanced at the screen, his expression darkening as he read the message. "They're escalating," he said grimly. "There's increased surveillance around the house. They're aware we're onto them." Lauren's breath caught, and her hands instinctively moved to the twins' bassinet, gripping it tightly. "What does that mean for us?" she asked, her voice trembling. "It means," Nathan replied, his tone calm but laced with urgency, "we're running out of time." The room descended into silence, the gravity of the situation pressing down on everyone like a heavy weight. Outside, the rain grew heavier, its relentless rhythm against the windows mirroring the mounting tension within. It felt as though the world itself was bracing for the storm yet to come. The day began quietly, offering Lauren a rare moment of calm amidst the constant tension that had consumed her life. Determined to regain a semblance of normalcy, she decided to handle a simple errand: grocery shopping. Despite Nathan's protests, she stood her ground. "I'll be fine," Lauren insisted, securing Ethan into his car seat while David hovered nearby, his brow furrowed with concern. "I can't stay hidden forever. Besides, I need to breathe some fresh air." David exchanged a reluctant glance with Nathan before conceding. "Take 2 of the security team with you," he said firmly, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. "Just in case." Lauren sighed but agreed. While she was aware the danger hadn't fully subsided, the confinement of David's expansive mansion had become stifling. Cradling Jacob in her arms, she gently settled him into his seat. His tiny fingers brushed against hers, offering a small, comforting reassurance. The grocery store buzzed with mid-morning activity, a stark contrast to the unease that had followed Lauren for weeks. The twins, nestled contentedly in their stroller, drew warm smiles from strangers as Lauren navigated the aisles. For a fleeting moment, she felt a sense of normalcy. But then, she saw him. A man lingered at the end of the aisle, feigning interest in canned goods, his gaze darting toward her. Lauren's heart quickened. She turned the stroller abruptly, heading toward the produce section, only to spot another man stationed near the entrance, his hand resting casually inside his jacket pocket. Her breath hitched. Trembling, she fumbled for her phone and quickly dialed David. "Something's wrong," she whispered, her voice shaky. "There are 2 of them. I think they're watching me." David's voice was steady and controlled. "Stay where you are. The security team is nearby. They'll get you out." Before she could respond, one of the men stepped into her path. His smile was cold, predatory, sending a chill down her spine. "Nice day for a stroll," he said, his tone laced with mockery. Lauren tightened her grip on the stroller, her protective instincts surging. "Leave me alone," she said, her voice firm despite her fear. The man didn't move. "Relax," he said, his eyes flicking toward the twins. "We just want to talk." Lauren's fear gave way to a fierce determination. "Step back," she demanded, her voice trembling but resolute. The second man began approaching from behind, and Lauren's mind raced. Her options were dwindling. Then, chaos erupted. One of David's security guards stormed through the store's entrance, his presence commanding immediate attention. "Ma'am, come with me," the guard ordered, positioning himself between her and the men. The scene devolved into a blur of action. The guards engaged the men in a heated clash, their shouts mingling with the startled cries of shoppers. Seizing the opportunity, Lauren gripped the stroller tightly and darted toward the emergency exit. Her heart pounded as she pushed through the door, desperate to shield her children from harm and escape the looming danger. Back at the mansion, David paced the living room anxiously, his tension palpable, as the security team returned with Lauren and the twins. Her complexion was pale, her hands trembling as she held Jacob close to her chest. "They knew where I was," Lauren murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. "They were waiting for me." David's jaw clenched, his expression shadowed with guilt. "I shouldn't have let you go," he admitted, his tone weighed down with regret. "I underestimated them." "It's not your fault," Lauren replied, though the lack of conviction in her voice betrayed her lingering fear. Nathan stormed into the room, his face dark with fury. "They've crossed the line," he growled, his intense gaze fixed on Lauren. "This is why I told you not to leave." Lauren's exhaustion flared into frustration. "I can't stay locked up forever, Nathan," she snapped, her voice trembling with emotion. "If it keeps you safe, you can," Nathan shot back, his tone rising with passion. Rachel stepped in between them, her voice calm but firm. "Arguing won't fix this," she interjected, her composed demeanor diffusing the rising tension. Turning toward Lauren, Rachel's expression softened. "Are you okay?" she asked gently. Lauren nodded, though her eyes glistened with unshed tears. Rachel placed a steadying hand on her shoulder. "We'll figure this out," Rachel assured her, her tone resolute. "You're not alone in this." Later that night, Rachel found Nathan on the back patio, staring into the rain-soaked garden. He stood motionless, his shoulders tense as the day's events replayed in his mind. She approached him quietly, her usual sharpness tempered by the shared weight of their responsibilities. "You don't seem to excel at staying calm," she remarked, her tone light but pointed. Nathan exhaled heavily, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "It's hard to stay calm when the people I care about are in danger," he admitted, his voice low and strained. Rachel leaned against the railing beside him, her posture relaxed but her eyes focused. "You're not the only one who cares," she said softly, her voice carrying an uncharacteristic warmth. "But we have to be smart about this. Recklessness won't protect her or the twins." Nathan turned his gaze toward her, his frustration easing into something gentler. "You're right," he acknowledged after a long pause. I can't lose her again." Rachel met his gaze, her expression steady, her voice unwavering. "You won't," she said firmly, "but you have to trust the rest of us to help." The unspoken understanding between them lingered in the cool night air, the rain outside mirroring the quiet determination that now settled between them. In the study, Nathan outlined his next steps to David and Rachel, his voice steady but tinged with urgency. "We're running out of time," he said, his tone resolute. "They're getting bolder, and we need answers now. I'm going back into the hospital." David's brow furrowed, concern evident in his expression. "It's too risky," he said firmly. "They'll be expecting something after today's events." Nathan's jaw tightened, his frustration barely contained. "That's exactly why we need to move quickly. Waiting only makes it more dangerous." Rachel's face remained impassive, her sharp mind clearly working through the possibilities. "If we're going to do this," she said, her voice calm but firm, "we need a solid plan. No room for improvisation." Nathan nodded, his resolve unshaken. "I'll handle it," he assured them, his determination unwavering. Outside, the rain continued to beat against the windows, its rhythmic patter underscoring the gravity of their discussion. In that room, the air grew heavier with shared purpose. The lines had been drawn, and there was no turning back. They knew the risks, but they also knew the stakes this fight was too important to lose. They had drawn the battle lines, and there was no turning back. The hospital loomed under the gray, overcast sky, its pristine white exterior a deceptive facade for the darkness Nathan knew lingered within. Dressed in a crisp lab coat and equipped with forged credentials, he stepped through the sliding glass doors. His demeanor was calm, his posture assured, but beneath the surface, his senses were razor-sharp, ready for the slightest disturbance. Rachel's voice buzzed softly in his ear through the concealed earpiece. "You're inside. Keep it smooth, Nathan. They're already on edge after your last visit." "Understood," Nathan murmured, his sharp eyes scanning the lobby. A nurse seated at the reception desk glanced up briefly before returning her attention to the computer screen. With a practiced air of confidence, Nathan approached. "Dr. Carrington," he announced, holding up a convincingly authentic ID badge. "Here for the facility evaluation." The nurse nodded, motioning toward a side door. "Administrative wing, second floor. Someone will meet you." Nathan thanked her, his voice steady, and strode toward the elevators, his heartbeat accelerating beneath his composed exterior. Rachel's voice cut through the silence again. A cautious warning. "They've got security cameras along the hallways. Keep your head down, don't linger." The elevator doors opened onto a stark corridor in the administrative wing. Frosted glass doors lined the walls, the sterile hum of fluorescent lights, underscoring the eerie quiet. Nathan paused briefly, scanning his surroundings before stopping in front of the records room. A quick glance confirmed the coast was clear. Using a small tool, he swiftly bypassed the lock and slipped inside. The room was small and dimly lit, filled with rows of filing cabinets and a lone computer terminal glowing faintly in the corner. Wasting no time, Nathan worked efficiently, inputting the access credentials Rachel had provided. As files began to load, his stomach tightened. The data revealed the horrifying extent of the operation: falsified birth records, incomplete adoption documents, and shadowy financial transactions with untraceable endpoints. "Rachel," he whispered, tension lacing his voice. "It's far worse than we imagined. They're trafficking infants, selling them to the highest bidders." Rachel's response came immediately, her tone sharp. "Extract everything you can and get out, Nathan. If they catch you in there, it won't end well." Nathan transferred the incriminating files onto a flash drive and tucked it securely into his pocket. As he turned to leave, the sound of the door handle turning froze him in place. Quickly, he ducked behind a row of cabinets, his pulse thundering. The door creaked open, and a man in a security uniform entered. His sharp eyes scanned the room, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the darkness. Nathan remained motionless, his breath held. The guard moved closer, his light sweeping dangerously near. Rachel's voice crackled urgently in his ear. "Get out now, Nathan. Don't wait." Waiting for the perfect moment, Nathan slipped out of the room while the guard was distracted by the computer terminal. He moved quickly down the hall, but the guard's sudden shout halted him momentarily. "Hey you, stop." Adrenaline surged as Nathan bolted toward the stairwell. The heavy thud of the guard's boots echoed behind him, the sound of the alarm slicing through the hospital's quiet sterility. Each shrill note fueled his determination to escape. Bursting through the stairwell door, Nathan descended 2 flights, his movement swift and calculated. Reaching the ground floor, he seamlessly merged with a group of visitors congregated near the main entrance. Keeping his head low, he maneuvered through the bustling crowd and slipped outside into the parking lot. Clear, he exhaled into the earpiece, his voice steady despite his ragged breathing. Heading to the drop point now. Back at the mansion, Lauren's relief at seeing Nathan alive was quickly eclipsed by fury. She stormed into the living room, where he stood, still catching his breath. "What were you thinking?" she demanded, her voice trembling with emotion. "I was thinking about protecting you," Nathan shot back, frustration flashing in his tone. "This isn't just about you anymore, Lauren. It's about Ethan and Jacob. I had to act." Lauren's eyes filled with tears as her voice softened, breaking slightly. "I can't lose you too, Nathan. I just got you back." Nathan's expression softened instantly, and he stepped closer. "I'm not going anywhere," he said gently, "but I can't just stand by while they're out there threatening us. I have to do something." For a long moment, Lauren held his gaze, her shoulders sagging as the fight drained from her. "Just promise me you'll be careful," she whispered. "I promise," Nathan replied firmly, his voice unwavering. Later that night, Lauren sat on the couch, her gaze fixed on Ethan and Jacob as they slept soundly in their bassinet. David entered quietly and settled beside her, the weight of the day evident in his demeanor. For a time, neither spoke, the silence filled only with the soft, rhythmic breaths of the twins. At last, Lauren broke the quiet, her voice barely above a whisper. "They just trust that I'll keep them safe," she said, the weight of her words hanging in the air. "You will," David assured her, his tone steady and kind. "You already are." Lauren turned to him, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "I'm scared, David," she admitted, her voice cracking. "Every time I think about what could have happened today, I feel like I'm failing them." "You're not failing," David said, his steady gaze meeting hers. "You're doing everything you can, and you're not alone in this. We're here for you, for them." Something in his calm, resolute tone eased the knot of tension in Lauren's chest. She nodded, a faint smile breaking through her exhaustion. "Thank you." David didn't respond with words, but the look in his eyes conveyed everything she needed to hear. As the house settled into an uneasy quiet, Nathan retreated to his room, the weight of his mission pressing down on him. He opened the files he had retrieved, and his stomach churned as he scanned the list of influential names tied to the trafficking operation in Portland: politicians, corporate executives, even members of law enforcement. He clenched his fists, his jaw tightening in anger. The corruption ran deeper than he had anticipated, and the adversaries they faced were more formidable than he had feared. Closing the laptop, Nathan leaned back, his resolve sharpening like a blade. They weren't just up against a clandestine network, they were battling the very foundations of the city itself. The storm outside mirrored the tension brewing within David's mansion. Rain lashed against the windows, and the wind howled through the surrounding trees. Nathan paced in the study, his voice taut as he relayed his findings to David, Rachel, and Lauren. "They're more entrenched than we thought," Nathan said, his tone heavy with frustration. "The names on this list include politicians, corporate leaders, even law enforcement. Their reach is everywhere." Rachel frowned, her arms crossing as her eyes narrowed. With that kind of support, it's no wonder they're this bold. They think they're untouchable. Lauren sat on the couch, cradling Jacob in her arms, her face pale with worry. "What do we do now?" she asked softly. "How do we stop something this massive?" David leaned against the desk, his expression dark and resolute. "We stay vigilant, we gather the evidence we need and bring it to the right people. But first we protect this house and everyone in it." Suddenly a low hum grew louder, like engines closing in. Nathan stiffened, his hand instinctively moving to his sidearm. "That's not good," he muttered under his breath. Rachel darted to the window, pulling the curtains aside. Her expression hardened instantly. "Vehicles, 3 of them. They've found us?" The mansion erupted into chaos as David's security team sprang into action. The attackers, armed and methodical, surrounded the property, their intentions unmistakable. Nathan took command, directing the security team with precision, while David secured Lauren and the twins in a safe room. But Lauren refused to stay hidden. "I'm not leaving them," she said fiercely, clutching Ethan and Jacob close to her chest. "Lauren, please," David urged, his voice strained but pleading. "We need you safe." Her eyes burned with determination. "They are my children, David. I'm not running while they're in danger." David hesitated, his jaw clenching tightly. Finally, he nodded, acknowledging her resolve. "Then we fight." The first breach came through the back door. Nathan and the security team met the intruders head-on, the sharp cracks of gunfire echoing through the mansion's halls. Rachel, armed with a pistol, moved with practiced efficiency, covering Nathan's flank. "Remind me to ask where you learned that," Nathan said, ducking behind the kitchen island as bullets ricocheted around them. Rachel smirked, her tone dry despite the chaos. "You're not the only one with secrets, Nathan." Meanwhile, the chaos reached Lauren. One of the attackers slipped past the defenses and found his way into the living room, where she was hiding with the twins. He towered over her, his presence radiating menace. "Don't make this harder than it has to be," he said, stepping closer. Lauren's heart pounded, but fear quickly gave way to fury. She grabbed the nearest lamp, her grip steady despite the tremor in her voice. "Stay away from my children," she said, her words trembling yet resolute. The man lunged, but Lauren swung the lamp with all her might. The heavy base connected with his head, and he staggered, giving her just enough time to scoop up the twins and retreat to a safer room. Meanwhile, David was relentless in his defense of the mansion. He moved with precision and purpose, his calm exterior masking the fire of determination within. When another attacker attempted to breach the safe room where Lauren had taken refuge, David intercepted him. His movements were swift, his blows unyielding. "You picked the wrong house," David growled, landing a decisive punch to the intruder's jaw. With the attacker subdued, David secured the door and turned to Lauren, his eyes filled with concern. "Are you all right?" he asked urgently. Lauren nodded, though her breath came in shallow, shaky gasps. "We're fine," she managed, her voice quivering. David placed a steady hand on her shoulder, his gaze unwavering. "We'll get through this," he said firmly. "I promise." The attackers retreated hastily as the piercing sound of sirens filled the air. Police vehicles pulled up to David's mansion, their lights flashing through the rain-soaked night. Officers, alerted by one of David's security guards, swiftly surrounded the remaining intruders, apprehending them before they could escape. The grounds were soon secured, a fragile calm settling over the property. In the aftermath, Rachel approached an officer, her expression resolute. She extended the flash drive Nathan had risked everything to retrieve. "This has everything you need to dismantle their operation," she said, her tone unwavering. "Make sure it's handled by the right people." The officer accepted the drive, his face grim with understanding. "We'll see to it." Inside the mansion, the atmosphere was quieter but heavy with the residue of fear and adrenaline. Lauren sat on the couch, both twins nestled securely in her arms. Nathan entered the room, his shirt streaked with dirt and damp from the chaos. He crouched down in front of her, his eyes scanning hers with concern. "Are you okay?" he asked softly, his voice tinged with guilt. Lauren nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "I was terrified, Nathan, but I wouldn't take my boys." "You didn't," Nathan replied, his tone steady. "You were remarkable." A faint, weary smile crossed Lauren's face as she reached out, gripping his hand tightly. "We all were." As the police processed the scene, Rachel and Nathan stood on the porch, watching as the rain tapered into a soft drizzle. Rachel cast him a sidelong glance, her expression thoughtful yet teasing. "You're not a bad man, Nathan," she said quietly, a trace of warmth in her voice, "even if you do have a knack for reckless decisions." Nathan chuckled, the tension in his shoulders easing as he leaned against the railing. "And you're not too terrible yourself, Rachel, for a lawyer." Rachel smirked, nudging him lightly with her elbow. "I'll take that as a compliment." Meanwhile, inside the mansion, David found Lauren sitting in the nursery. The soft glow of a nightlight illuminated her as she watched Ethan and Jacob sleep peacefully in their crib. David stepped into the room, his presence a quiet but steady reassurance. "They're safe now," he said in a low, comforting voice. Lauren turned to him, her eyes shimmering with gratitude. "Because of you. Because of all of you." David crouched beside her, his hand brushing hers gently. "You're stronger than you give yourself credit for, Lauren. You didn't need us. You just needed to trust yourself." For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Lauren felt the oppressive weight on her chest begin to lift. She nodded, leaning her head against David's shoulder as the sound of the twins' soft, rhythmic breathing filled the room. In that moment, peace felt possible. The weeks after the attack were marked by a mix of resolution and introspection. The flash drive Nathan had risked everything to retrieve became the linchpin of a far-reaching investigation. The exposure of the trafficking ring sent shockwaves across Portland, toppling influential figures from their seats of power. Arrests were swift and public outrage was deafening, a testament to the magnitude of the crimes uncovered. In David's study, Nathan and Rachel sat across from one another, poring over the latest updates from law enforcement. Nathan leaned back in his chair, the lines of worry on his face easing for the first time in weeks. A rare flicker of calm softened his usual intensity. "They got them," Rachel said, her eyes scanning the screen of her laptop. "The evidence was rock solid. This operation is done." Nathan exhaled, a deep, measured breath that seemed to lift a weight off his chest. "It's not just about shutting them down," he said, his tone thoughtful. "It's about making sure no one ever has to face this again." Rachel tilted her head, her sharp eyes unexpectedly warm. "You care a lot more than you let people see." He smirked, a faint trace of humor in his expression. "And you don't." Her lips twitched into a small smile. "Touché." For a moment, the room was enveloped in a peaceful silence, the kind that didn't require words to convey understanding. Nathan studied Rachel, his gaze thoughtful, his voice soft when he finally spoke. "You know," he began, "you're remarkable under pressure." Rachel arched an eyebrow, her smirk returning. "Was that a compliment, Nathan?" He admitted, his voice steady and sincere. "You're not just a lawyer, Rachel. You're a fighter." Her gaze lingered on him, the weight of unspoken thoughts passing between them. "So are you, Nathan," she replied, her voice carrying a note of quiet admiration. In that shared moment, amidst the echoes of their shared battles, an unbreakable bond began to solidify, a connection forged not by words, but by the depth of their shared resolve. Meanwhile, Lauren sat quietly in the nursery, her eyes resting on Ethan and Jacob as they napped peacefully in their crib. The soft glow of the evening light filtered through the curtains, casting a warm, tranquil hue over the room. She barely noticed when David appeared in the doorway, leaning against the frame, his presence both reassuring and grounding, a steady force amidst the chaos her life had become. "Do you have a minute?" David asked, stepping further inside. Lauren nodded, gesturing for him to sit. He eased into the chair beside her, his gaze fixed on the twins. For a moment he was silent, the weight of unspoken thoughts hanging between them. "I've been thinking," he began, his voice unusually hesitant, "about everything." She remained quiet, sensing the gravity of what he was about to say. "You and the boys," David continued, his tone soft yet deliberate. "You've brought something into my life I didn't even realize was missing. For so long, I've buried myself in work, building walls around myself, convincing myself I didn't need more. But now—" He exhaled, his words trailing off briefly before he met her gaze. Lauren's breath hitched, her heart pounding as she took in the vulnerability etched into his features. "David." "I care about you, Lauren," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "More than I thought I could. I don't just want to keep you safe. I want to be part of your life, a real part. And theirs too." Tears shimmered in Lauren's eyes as she listened, her voice trembling when she finally spoke. "You mean that?" Every word, David replied, his tone unwavering. "But only if you'll let me." Without hesitation, Lauren reached out, her hand finding his. "David, you've already been part of our lives. You've been our anchor when everything else felt like it was falling apart. I can't imagine doing this without you." Their hands tightened, the unspoken connection between them solidifying into something undeniable. For the first time in what felt like forever, Lauren allowed herself to picture a future of family. It wasn't a fleeting dream anymore, it was something tangible, something she could believe in. And as they sat together in the quiet nursery, hope began to take root. The next morning, sunlight poured through the windows of David's mansion, bathing the once shadowed rooms in a warm, golden light. Lauren stood in the kitchen, cradling Jacob in her arms, while Ethan babbled happily in his high chair. The soft morning sounds filled the space as David entered, placing a light kiss on her temple, before reaching for a mug of coffee. Moments later, Nathan and Rachel joined them, their easy banter adding to the calm atmosphere. For the first time in years, Lauren felt a profound sense of peace. Though the scars of her past remained, the heavy weight of it no longer dictated her every moment. She had found her family not only in Nathan, her brother, but also in David, Rachel, and the life they were building together. Later that day, Lauren stood on the wraparound porch of a new home nestled in a quiet, tree-lined town. A mug of tea warmed her hands as she gazed out at Ethan and Jacob, who were playing on a blanket spread across the lush green lawn. Their joyful laughter mingled with the soft chirping of birds and the occasional rustle of leaves stirred by the gentle breeze. David stepped out from the house, carrying a tray with 2 steaming cups of coffee. He set one down on the porch railing beside Lauren and took his place next to her. "Peaceful, isn't it?" he said, his voice calm and steady. Lauren smiled, her gaze resting on the twins, "More than I ever thought possible." David nodded, his hand lightly brushing hers as he leaned against the railing. "It's a fresh start, Lauren. For all of us." The decision to move to this serene suburban retreat had been David's idea. He wanted to give Lauren and the twins a chance to rebuild their lives far from the haunting shadows of their past. The house, modest by David's standards, was perfectly suited for a family. With its cozy kitchen, a nursery flooded with sunlight, and a spacious backyard for Ethan and Jacob to grow and explore, it felt like home. Inside, Nathan and Rachel were busy unpacking boxes in the living room. Nathan pulled out a picture frame and stared at the photo, a long-ago snapshot of him, Lauren, and their parents, taken during simpler, happier times before their family had been torn apart. Rachel glanced up, noticing his pensive expression. "You okay?" she asked softly. Nathan nodded, though his voice was quieter than usual. "Yeah, just thinking about how far we've come." She stepped closer, her tone playful but kind. "You've come a long way, Nathan, from brooding secret agent to family man." He chuckled, setting the frame carefully on a shelf. "And you from relentless lawyer too. Well, slightly less relentless lawyer." Rachel smirked, nudging him lightly. "I prefer multifaceted." Their laughter faded into a companionable silence. Their shared glances lingered just a moment longer each time, the bond between them, forged through chaos and challenge, beginning to grow into something deeper. Yet, they were in no rush, content to let the connection bloom in its own time, savoring the quiet moments together. Later in the day, David found Lauren in the nursery, carefully organizing Ethan and Jacob's ever-growing collection of toys. Jacob babbled cheerfully in his crib, the sound filling the room with a warmth that felt almost tangible. David lingered in the doorway, leaning against the frame as he watched her with a quiet smile. "You've turned this place into a real home," he said, his voice low but filled with admiration. Lauren looked over her shoulder, her expression softening as she met his gaze. "It already feels like home because of you." David stepped into the room, his movements deliberate and steady, his eyes never leaving hers. "Lauren," he began, his tone carrying a weight of sincerity, "I meant what I said before. You and the boys are my family now. I want to be here for you in every way always." Her hand hesitated before reaching out to his, her voice trembling with a mix of vulnerability and gratitude. "You already are, David. I never thought I'd find this again, the feeling of truly belonging. But with you, it feels real. It feels like I can finally breathe." David's hand tightened gently around hers, his touch a silent reassurance. Without a word, he pulled her into an embrace that was neither hurried nor hesitant. It was quiet, profound, and deeply grounding. For a long moment, they stood like that, the chaos of their pasts dissolving into the stillness of the present. The weight they had carried alone seemed to lighten, replaced by the quiet promise of a shared future. As the day waned, the family gathered on the wraparound porch of David's new home. Rachel accepted a glass of iced tea from Nathan as they joined David and Lauren on the wooden swing. Ethan toddled unsteadily across the lush lawn, his laughter ringing out as Jacob clapped his hands in pure delight. Lauren's eyes followed her boys, her heart swelling with a gratitude so profound it almost brought tears. "I never thought this was possible," she said softly, almost to herself, her voice carrying a mix of wonder and disbelief. David turned to her, his expression steady and full of quiet conviction. "You made it possible, Lauren. You never gave up. Not on yourself, not on them." Nathan, sitting casually on the steps, glanced over with a grin. "And we're here because of you, sis, all of us." Rachel raised her glass, her voice warm and resolute. "To new beginnings." The setting sun dipped lower, painting the horizon in breathtaking hues of gold, pink, and lavender. Lauren took a deep breath, letting her gaze sweep across the faces surrounding her. These were the people she had fought to protect, the family she had found amidst the chaos. For the first time in years, a calm peace settled over her. As Ethan and Jacob's giggles echoed in the golden twilight, Lauren leaned her head against David's strong shoulder. She wasn't merely surviving anymore, she was truly living with the people she loved most by her side. The future, once uncertain and fraught with fear, now shimmered with the promise of joy and belonging. This was her home. This was her hope. This was everything she had dreamed of and more. In this heartfelt tale, we followed Lauren, a mother determined to protect her twin boys, Ethan and Jacob, from a dark conspiracy that sought to take them away. With the unwavering support of David, a man who stepped up as both protector and partner, her long-lost brother Nathan, and their steadfast ally Rachel, Lauren found the courage to face overwhelming challenges. Their journey wasn't just about uncovering the truth behind a corrupt operation, it was about building trust, rediscovering family, and creating a sanctuary for a new beginning. From moments of despair to triumphant victories, the story reminds us of the strength found in unity and the resilience of the human spirit. It's a testament to how love can rebuild what's been broken and guide us toward a brighter future. We'd love to hear your thoughts. What part of the story resonated with you the most? Did Lauren's courage inspire you, or did the steadfast loyalty of her newfound family strike a chord? Share your reflections in the comments below. Your voice matters and helps us grow as a community. Don't forget to hit the like button if you found this story meaningful, subscribe to stay connected with more stories like this, and share this video with those who would appreciate its message. Let's create a space where stories of hope and resilience inspire us all. Thank you for being part of this journey with us.